My name's Andrew Armstrong. I'm the archaeologist at Gloucester City Council, and we're doing a video today because two very important pieces of Roman stonework have just finished being conserved and have now been deposited with the Museum of Gloucester. These pieces of stonework were found in 2019, and they were actually found in Southgate Street in front of St Mary deCrypt church, and they were found during the excavation of a new sewer connection to the church, of all things. And that required the builders to dig 3 meters down in front of the church. And whilst they were doing that, the archaeologists watching the work from Avon Archaeology found these two very well-preserved pieces of Roman stonework and were able to recover them. Now, since then, the stones have been off to be conserved, and they've been beautifully conserved and have now been deposited with the museum itself. The conservation work was paid for by Mary deCrypt, Discover deCrypt project, by Gloucester City Council, and with a contribution from the Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeological Society. So this is the first of the 2 pieces of stonework that were recovered from Southgate Street. And this is a very large piece of stone. Hopefully you can see it's about 80 centimetres long and it's about 40 centimetres wide. And it originally would have come from an even bigger piece of stone. It's been broken off at a later date. Now, this is actually upside down. Originally, it would have been the other way up. And this is a cornice. So it's a projecting ornamentation that would have projected outwards from the wall, probably at first floor level. And you would have looked up and you would have seen these designs above you extending along the front of a building, presumably the front of a building. And what these designs are, there's a thin layer of leaf carvings which have been carved here, and then there's a wider layer where we might have a mix of leaves and flowers which have been put onto this stone here. And this has all been carved in Painswick stone, which has then been apparently had a wash applied to it to make it look finer. This is by the Romans. And this would have been part of a larger fragment which presumably must have fronted onto a very sizable public building. You can imagine if this is sat on top of your wall, then the wall itself must be very substantial. If you're putting stones this big on top of a wall, then it must have been very big indeed. Now, when this was found, it was actually in 2 pieces. Perhaps you can see a crack there. And it was also very dirty. And what the conservators have done is they have pegged, using metal pegs, these 2 pieces back together very carefully, and they've used lime mortar, I believe, to bind the 2 together, and they've also cleaned the stonework to museum display levels. So now you can see the detail of the stonework and the decoration, whereas before it was looking very, very sorry for itself. So this is the first piece of stonework which looks like it's from some kind of sizable public building. So this is the second piece of stonework that was recovered on site, and this is actually the top of a Roman altar. So this would have had below it an inscription. Sadly, we're missing where the inscription would have been, which would have been down here. Now, the back of the altar hasn't been worked, so this wasn't freestanding. The specialists who looked at it believe that this would have been flush to the wall of a building. So we wouldn't have seen the back of the altar here. So the altar would have stood up against a wall with an inscription below it, and it would have probably been on some form of plinth lower down, and we just have this top bit. Now, Roman altars are used like an altar from any religion. They're used as a focus for worship. We don't know what god this one was dedicated to, and we don't know what it was used for. But again, interestingly, it's found in association with a very large piece of stonework from a very large public building, and it may well be that the 2 are associated. Now, St Mary deCrypt is very near the centre of Gloucester. It's actually very near the Roman Forum, which included a very large public building known as the Forum Basilica, which was a kind of mix of town hall and temple and meeting place. And it's possible that both of these fragments come from the Forum Basilica or perhaps from a nearby temple. So really interesting and precious remains of the city, and a really good example of what's lost if we don't have archaeologists watching building work in the city. If there hadn't been that archaeologist from Avon Archaeology there to look out for these, it's very likely they would have been destroyed or just thrown back in the hole. So a very good result that they were spotted and are now at the museum. where they are now in public ownership and one day will go on display. Now, a really interesting feature about the top of this altar is on the other side, and to look at that we're going to have to move it. We have very carefully put the altar upright. So what we have here either side of the centre of the altar is the remains of some scroll work, and then in the centre we have the focus of the altar here, and hopefully you can see some blackening there. Now this has actually got the specialists who looked at it quite excited, because not only is there evidence for carbon there, the stone itself has gone very slightly pink from heat. And that's because the standard approach for Romans when worshipping was to light a fire, a small fire, in the focus of the altar, the top of the altar, whilst they were making libations to whichever deity they were worshipping here. And we find images of Roman religious worship where the worshipper will be holding a bowl or a cup, often containing wine, as a libation above the flame at the top of the altar. So this is really lovely evidence for that form of worship. And I'm told that that is very rarely found, so really brilliant. Now, another interesting fact about the altar is when we found it, it was in two pieces, and the conservators again have bolted this together and very carefully cleaned the altar up whilst preserving the evidence for the burning there. What they also found out is there is in fact a kind of pink, light pink render on the outside of the altar here. So while it's been in use, it has been lime washed and rendered, presumably to keep it looking nice while it was in use. So a really beautiful object, both of them. And what's going to happen next? Well, the aim, the hope, is that these objects can be displayed at St Mary deCrypt Church. At the moment they've been deposited with the museum and they're in storage. But the hope is that Discover deCrypt will be able to display both artefacts in the church as part of future works they're hoping to do there. And that would be really brilliant. The other outcome, I suppose, is that it could be displayed at the museum if need be. But the hope is to display them at Discover deCrypt. So at some point in the next few years, hopefully we'll have more information about that and we'll let everyone know.